Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was New Year's Eve, a time when most people gathered to celebrate the start of a new chapter. However, for Clara, the evening began with an unsettling sense of foreboding. She had been invited to a party at an old manor deep in the woods, a sprawling, centuries-old estate her co-worker Beth had recently inherited. The idea of ringing in the new year in such a unique location initially intrigued Clara, but as the evening approached, unease crept in. Beth had described the place as a fixer-upper with character, but Clara couldn't shake the rumors she'd heard at work. Some claimed the house had a dark history, a tale involving a reclusive family who vanished without explanation decades ago. Dismissing it as gossip, Clara reluctantly decided to go, thinking it would be a story to tell later. The drive to the manor was eerie. Fog rolled in thick waves across the winding road, and her GPS struggled to maintain a signal. When she finally arrived, the house loomed against the night sky like a shadowy monolith. Its peeling paint and broken shutters gave it a haunted appearance, yet the sound of laughter and music spilling out of its grand windows reassured her. Inside, the party was in full swing. The antique furniture had been pushed aside to make room for a makeshift dance floor, and a large table groaned under the weight of hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Clara greeted Beth, who seemed more animated than usual, her eyes sparkling with an odd intensity. "This place is amazing," Clara said, trying to mask her unease. Beth grinned. "Wait until midnight. I've got something special planned." The cryptic comment stuck with Clara as she mingled with other guests. Most of them were mutual co-workers or friends of Beth's. Clara tried to relax, sipping her drink and chatting with people she barely knew, but something about the atmosphere felt off. Despite the cheerful facade, there was an underlying tension in the air. As the night wore on, Clara found herself drawn to a portrait hanging in the hallway. The painting depicted a family of 4, 2 parents, a teenage boy, and a young girl, posing in front of the very manor they were standing in. The children's faces were strangely lifelike, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. "Creepy, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Clara jumped and turned to see a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. "Yeah," she admitted. "Do you know who they are?" He nodded, a shadow passing over his face. "The Aldrich family. They built this house in the 1800s. The story goes they disappeared on New Year's Eve. No one knows what happened to them." Clara shivered. "That's unsettling." The man smiled faintly. "There are a lot of stories about this place. Be careful where you wander." Before she could respond, he melted back into the crowd. Clara glanced at the portrait one last time and felt a sudden urge to get some fresh air. Stepping outside, she was struck by how quiet it was compared to the lively party inside. The fog had thickened, and the woods seemed unnaturally still. A sound broke the silence, a faint whispering, too low to make out but persistent enough to send a chill down her spine. She turned, expecting to see someone, but the yard was empty. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she decided to head back inside. As the clock approached midnight, Beth gathered everyone in the main hall. She stood on the grand staircase, holding a vintage key that glinted in the light of the chandelier. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I have a surprise. This key unlocks a hidden door in the basement. I thought it would be fun to explore it together to welcome the new year." The crowd murmured with excitement, though Clara felt a wave of unease. She considered slipping away unnoticed, but curiosity got the better of her. Beth led the group downstairs, the guests laughing and joking as they descended into the cold, damp basement. The hidden door was indeed there, concealed behind a row of shelves. With a dramatic flourish, Beth unlocked it and pushed it open. The air that seeped out was musty, carrying the scent of decay. Inside was a narrow tunnel carved from stone, leading deeper into the earth. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Beth laughed. "Don't be such a buzzkill, Clara. It's just an adventure." One by one, the guests filed into the tunnel, their phones lighting the way. Clara lingered at the back, her heart pounding. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls slick with moisture. The further they went, the quieter the group became, their earlier enthusiasm giving way to nervous tension. Finally, they emerged into a cavernous chamber. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, their meaning indecipherable. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself were alive. Beth stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said, her voice echoing. "This is where they vanished." "What are you talking about?" someone asked. Beth turned to face the group, her smile unnervingly wide. "The Aldridge family. They performed a ritual here to summon something. But they didn't survive, and now we have a chance to finish what they started." A stunned silence fell over the room. Then, someone laughed nervously. "Okay, Beth, you've had your fun. Let's get out of here." Beth's smile faltered, replaced by a look of cold determination. "I'm not joking." Before anyone could react, the symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with an unnatural light. The room grew unbearably hot, and a low, guttural sound reverberated through the chamber. Clara felt her knees buckle as a wave of nausea overtook her. "Stop this, Beth," she screamed, but Beth was unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the altar. The light grew brighter, blinding, and the guttural sound rose to a deafening roar. Then, everything went dark. When Clara woke, she was back in the manor's main hall. The clock struck midnight, and the sound of fireworks echoed in the distance. The party was gone, no music, no laughter, no people. The house was silent and empty, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Clara stumbled outside, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her car was still there, but the fog had lifted, revealing an unfamiliar landscape. The woods were gone, replaced by barren fields stretching endlessly in every direction. She tried calling for help, but her phone displayed no signal. Panic set in as she realized she was utterly alone. The house loomed behind her, its dark windows like empty eyes watching her every move. Clara turned back to the door, unsure if she should enter or run. Before she could decide, a whisper reached her ears, soft, insistent, and unmistakably close. "Finish the ritual. Story the end."
Story number 2.
The bitter wind howled through the trees as Mia tightened her scarf, glancing nervously at the dark road ahead. It was New Year's Eve, and she was driving to a cabin in the mountains where her college friends had planned a small reunion. The idea sounded wonderful at first, ringing in the new year in a cozy, secluded spot surrounded by close friends. But as she drove deeper into the forest, the loneliness of the empty roads and the thickening fog gnawed at her nerves. The cabin, owned by her friend Eric's family, was an old structure that had been vacant for years. According to Eric, it had been built in the 1920s and still retained much of its rustic charm. But Mia couldn't shake the unease she felt as her car's headlights finally illuminated the wooden structure, its silhouette stark against the dense woods behind it. The cabin seemed to lean ever so slightly, as if the forest were trying to reclaim it. Inside, the mood was warm and lively. Eric greeted her at the door, and the familiar faces of friends she hadn't seen in years instantly put her at ease. There was Caroline, always the life of the party, Jake, who had been her lab partner in college, and Sarah, her quiet, thoughtful confidant. The group was small, just the 5 of them, and the crackling fire in the stone hearth gave the space an inviting glow. "Glad you made it," Eric said, handing her a mug of spiked cider. "We thought the fog might keep you away." "Almost did," Mia admitted, forcing a smile. "This place is something else." Eric chuckled. "Yeah, it's old, but it has its quirks. Wait until you hear it creak at night." Mia joined the others in the living room, and for a while, she forgot her unease. They reminisced about their college days, played board games, and shared drinks. The hours flew by, and as midnight approached, Eric clapped his hands together. "All right, you guys are going to love this," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "There's a hidden room in this cabin. My grandfather built it during Prohibition. It's been sealed for decades, but I found the key a few weeks ago. I thought it'd be cool to open it tonight." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "A hidden room? What's in it?" Eric shrugged. "No idea. Probably just old junk, but it's New Year's Eve. Let's do something memorable." Jake and Caroline were immediately on board, their curiosity outweighing any hesitation. Mia and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, but reluctantly followed as Eric led them to the far end of the cabin. There, he pushed aside a heavy bookshelf to reveal a small, locked door. The lock creaked as Eric turned the key, and the door swung open with a groan. A narrow staircase led downward, the air growing colder with each step. The group descended, their phone flashlights casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. The stairs ended in a low-ceilinged room with dirt floors and shelves lined with dusty jars and boxes. In the center of the room stood a table covered with a faded cloth. On top of it rested an old leather-bound book and a tarnished candelabra. The air was thick, damp, and carried a faint metallic scent that made Mia's stomach churn. "Whoa," Jake whispered, picking up the book. Its pages were yellowed and covered in strange symbols, unlike anything he'd seen before. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Eric took the book from Jake and flipped through it. "Looks like some kind of ritual book. My grandpa was a strange guy, but this is next level." Caroline laughed nervously. Maybe he was into some weird occult stuff. It was the 1920s. People were into seances and spiritualism back then. Mia stepped back, her pulse quickening. "We should leave this alone. It doesn't feel right." But Eric's curiosity had already gotten the better of him. He lit the candelabra and placed it on the table, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Come on. It's just a book. Let's read something from it. It'll be fun." Before Mia could protest, Eric began reciting the words from one of the pages. The language was harsh and guttural, the syllables scraping against the silence like nails on glass. The moment he finished, the flames on the candelabra flared, turning an unnatural shade of green. A deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through their bones. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew impossibly heavy. Mia grabbed Sarah's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Eric, stop this." Eric's face was pale, his bravado gone. I didn't think anything would actually happen." The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and then it stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow, when Caroline let out a blood-curdling scream. In the far corner of the room, something moved. It was impossible to describe, an amorphous shadow that seemed to ripple and pulse as if it were alive. Its edges were jagged, and its presence radiated an overwhelming sense of dread. "We need to go," Mia said, her voice firm despite the terror gripping her. "Now." The group bolted for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. But as they reached the top, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the cabin. Jake pounded on the wood, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, the hum returned, growing louder and more menacing. The shadow creature began to take form, limbs stretching unnaturally as it slithered toward them. Its presence was suffocating, its movements jerky and inhuman. Mia grabbed the candelabra and threw it at the creature in desperation. The flames sputtered and died as the metal clanged uselessly against the floor. Eric frantically flipped through the book, his hands trembling. "There's got to be a way to stop this," he shouted. But before he could read another word, the creature lunged, its shadowy tendrils wrapped around Jake, pulling him into the darkness. His screams were cut off as the room descended into chaos. The remaining four scrambled up the stairs like using their combined strength to force the door open. When it finally gave way, they tumbled into the main room of the cabin, slamming the bookshelf back into place. For a moment, the silence was deafening. "What the hell was that?" Caroline sobbed, her face streaked with tears. Eric shook his head, his hand still gripping the book. "I don't know. I didn't know." "You shouldn't have opened that door," Mia yelled, her fear boiling over into anger. "You unleashed something that shouldn't exist." Before anyone could respond, the hum started again, this time coming from the walls around them. The cabin itself seemed to groan, the wood warping and bending as if the structure were alive. Windows shattered, and the fire in the hearth roared uncontrollably. Mia grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to get out of here." The group ran outside, the freezing air biting at their skin, but the nightmare wasn't over. The shadow creature followed, its form larger now, towering above the treetops. The forest seemed to twist and shift as if it were working against them. They sprinted toward the cars, but none of them would start. The creature closed in, its tendrils snaking toward them. Caroline tripped, and before Mia could reach her, she was dragged, screaming, into the darkness. Eric dropped the book and fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "It's my fault. I'll stop it. I have to stop it." Before Mia could stop him, he ran back toward the cabin, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The creature turned, following him, its attention momentarily diverted. "Come on!" Mia urged Sarah, dragging her toward the tree line. "We need to get as far away as possible." The two of them ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they would give out. They didn't stop until they reached a clearing where the faint glow of dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. Turning back, they saw the cabin engulfed in an otherworldly light, the creature's form disappearing into the void. Eric and Caroline were gone. Jake was gone. And the cabin, along with whatever evil it contained, seemed to collapse in on itself, leaving nothing but an empty patch of scorched earth. Mia and Sarah never spoke of that night again. Every New Year's Eve, they would each stay awake, haunted by the memories of what they had seen and the friends they had lost. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The icy drizzle soaked through Daniel's jacket as he trudged down the empty street, his breath coming out in puffs of steam. It was New Year's Eve, and he should have been at the party his best friend Jared had invited him to downtown. But instead, he was walking alone toward a small house on the outskirts of town, a house he'd never been to before, in a neighborhood that didn't even show up on Google Maps. He wouldn't have gone at all if it weren't for Sophie. Sophie had been his high school crush, the girl he thought about for years but never had the courage to ask out. Out of nowhere, she'd messaged him earlier that day, inviting him to a New Year's get-together with a small group of friends. Her words were warm, familiar, as if no time had passed since they'd last spoken. It was enough to lure him out of his comfort zone. The directions she gave led him to a narrow street lined with dilapidated houses. Most were dark and uninviting, but at the end of the road, one house stood out. Its windows glowed softly, and faint laughter spilled out into the otherwise silent night. Daniel hesitated at the gate. The house looked older than he'd expected, its paint peeling and the porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. Something about it felt off. But then the door opened, and there she was, Sophie. Her smile was as radiant as he remembered, and for a moment, all his doubts melted away. "Daniel!" she called out, waving him over. "Come on in. It's freezing out there." He smiled back, his heart pounding, and walked up the creaking steps. Inside, the house was warm but dimly lit, with candles scattered around the living room. A few other people were lounging on mismatched furniture, chatting quietly. They looked up as Daniel entered, their expressions unreadable. "This is Daniel," Sophie said, introducing him. "We went to high school together." The others nodded politely, but their gazes lingered on him a little too long. A tall man with a shaved head stood up and extended his hand. "I'm Lucas. Welcome." Daniel shook his hand, feeling the man's grip linger a moment longer than necessary. He glanced around, noting the strange decor. Old, faded paintings hung crookedly on the walls, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched since the 70s. The whole place smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. "Drink?" Sophie offered, holding out a glass of red wine. "Sure," Daniel said, though he didn't particularly want it. He took the glass and sipped, the bitter liquid burning slightly as it went down. Sophie sat beside him, her presence warm and magnetic. Despite the strange vibe, he began to relax. But as the night wore on, something gnawed at him. The conversations around him felt hollow. The others, Lucas, a woman named Abby, and an older man they called Greg, seemed to speak in circles, never really answering his questions. They asked him a lot about himself, though, where he lived, who he was close to, and whether anyone knew he'd be at the party. At one point, Sophie leaned in close, her voice low. "You're really brave for coming all the way out here." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Not many people do. It's so far out and, well, you'll see." She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. Before he could press her, Lucas stood and clapped his hands. "It's almost midnight. Time for the main event." The others stood and moved toward the back of the house. Sophie grabbed Daniel's hand, pulling him along. "You'll love this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. They walked down a narrow hallway that led to a heavy wooden door. Lucas unlocked it with a key he pulled from his pocket, and the group descended a steep staircase into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of mildew was replaced by something sharper, more acrid. The basement was larger than Daniel had expected, its stone walls covered in strange jagged symbols. In the center of the room stood a low stone table surrounded by black candles. On the table was an object covered by a cloth. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. It's tradition, Sophie said, her smile unnerving now. We've been doing this for years. The others began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The sound sent chills down Daniel's spine, and the symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer in the flickering candlelight. I think I should go, he said, backing toward the stairs. Sophie's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. Stay. It's not midnight yet. Daniel's pulse quickened as Lucas removed the cloth from the table, revealing a small, ornately carved box. He opened it, and Daniel caught a glimpse of what looked like a blackened, shriveled heart. What the hell is that? Daniel demanded, his voice rising. Lucas ignored him, lifting the heart out of the box with both hands. The chanting grew louder, and the air in the room seemed to thrum with energy. Sophie's grip on Daniel's arm tightened. You're the guest of honor, she said softly. Daniel wrenched his arm free, his panic overwhelming him. He bolted for the stairs, but as he reached them, the symbols on the walls flared to life, their glow casting eerie shadows across the room. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against him like an invisible weight. You can't leave now, Lucas said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The ritual has begun. Daniel turned to see the others advancing toward him, their faces eerily calm. Sophie's eyes were black now, the warmth in them replaced by something ancient and malevolent. Stay, she said again, her voice layered with something guttural and inhuman. It'll only hurt for a moment. The candles flared, and the room was suddenly filled with a deafening roar. Daniel screamed as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and twisting around him. And then, silence. When Daniel woke, he was lying in his car, parked on an empty road. The house was gone. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, a text from Jared lighting up the screen. Dude, where are you? The party's lit. Don't tell me you flaked. Daniel stared at the message, his hands trembling. He looked around, trying to make sense of where he was, but nothing felt right. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, with no sign of the house or any other landmarks. The only thing he could hear was the faint echo of Sophie's voice, whispering in his ear. It's only just begun. Story the end.
Story number 4.
On New Year's Eve, 1999, the world was on edge. The Y2K scare was at its peak, and people feared the new millennium would bring technological chaos. For Claire Thompson, the date had a different significance. It marked the first New Year's Eve she'd be spending alone in her small, secluded cabin in the Colorado mountains. She had moved there 6 months earlier, eager for solitude and a fresh start after a messy divorce. Claire's cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense forest. It was idyllic in the daytime, but could feel oppressive at night. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, she settled on the couch with a glass of wine, the faint crackle of the fire providing comforting background noise. Outside, snow had begun to fall, and the world was wrapped in an eerie, muffled silence. By 10 p.m., Claire was feeling the effects of the wine, and her initial anxiety over being alone giving way to a mellow sense of contentment. She flipped through a photo album, reminiscing about happier times. The moment of peace was shattered by a loud knock at the door. She froze, heart pounding. Visitors were rare, especially this late, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Setting her glass down, she approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood on her porch, his face partially obscured by a hood and the falling snow. He waved awkwardly when he saw her looking. "Hello?" Claire called through the door, her voice trembling slightly. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice muffled by the scarf around his mouth. "My car broke down up the road. My phone's dead. Could I use yours to call for help?" Claire hesitated. The man didn't look threatening, but something about the situation felt off. Still, she couldn't leave someone stranded in the freezing cold. "Wait there," she said. "I'll get my phone." She retrieved her cordless phone from the kitchen and opened the door just a crack to hand it to him. He smiled, his teeth yellowed and uneven, and reached for it. As he did, his hand brushed hers, and Claire felt a jolt of unease. His skin was ice cold. "Thank you," he said, stepping back. Claire closed the door and locked it, watching him through the peephole as he dialed. He spoke briefly, then handed the phone back. "Thank you so much," he said. "A tow truck's on its way." Claire nodded and closed the door without another word, locking it firmly. She returned to the couch, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. An hour passed and midnight was approaching. Claire was beginning to relax again when she heard another noise. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow around the cabin. Her heart raced as she grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. She scanned the yard but saw nothing. The snow was falling heavier now and visibility was poor. Then she saw them, footprints fresh and distinct, leading from the road to her porch and around the side of the cabin. Maybe it's the tow truck driver, she whispered to herself, though she didn't quite believe it. She turned off the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness, and waited in tense silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all she could hear was the wind howling outside. Then came the sound of tapping, soft and deliberate, on the living room window. Claire's breath hitched. She forced herself to look, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Standing just outside the window was the man, his hood now pulled back to reveal a gaunt, pale face. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Let me in," he mouthed, his breath fogging the glass. Claire stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she almost couldn't press the buttons. "There's a man outside my cabin," she whispered to the operator. "He's trying to get in." The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but the nearest patrol car was at least 20 minutes out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. Claire held her breath, straining to hear. A new sound reached her ears. The creak of the back door. She had locked it, hadn't she? Grabbing a kitchen knife, she positioned herself near the hallway, her eyes darting between the doors. The creak turned into a loud crash as the back door burst open. "Leave," she screamed, brandishing the knife. There was no response, just heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching. Claire retreated into the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She wedged a chair under the doorknob and pressed her back against it, clutching the knife. The footsteps stopped outside her door. "I just wanted to use your phone," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. Claire didn't reply. The doorknob rattled violently, then stopped. She heard him chuckle softly. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said. "It's dangerous." And then, silence. Minutes felt like hours as Claire waited, her knife poised. Eventually, she heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. She stayed put until she was sure the police had arrived. When the officers swept the cabin, the man was gone, but they found evidence he had been living in the woods nearby, a makeshift campsite filled with disturbing items. Women's clothing, a collection of knives, and a notebook filled with ramblings about purging the unworthy. Claire never spent another night in that cabin.
Story number 5.
On New Year's Eve 2012, Daniel Ortega was excited to ring in the new year with his girlfriend, Mia. They had booked a remote Airbnb in the Appalachian Mountains, eager for a quiet, romantic getaway away from the noisy city. The cabin was perfect, rustic, cozy, and surrounded by thick woods. It was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, blanketed in snow with a fireplace crackling inside. The host, an older man named Harold, had been friendly but odd. When they arrived, he met them at the driveway, his large frame almost imposing in the fading afternoon light. His demeanor was overly polite, but there was something in his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You folks be careful out here," Harold had said as he handed over the keys. "No cell service this far out, and if you hear anything strange, just stay inside. Sometimes the coyotes come close to the cabin." Daniel and Mia had exchanged amused glances, chalking it up to small-town eccentricity. They thanked him and waved him off as he drove away. By 9 p.m., they had settled in, playing board games and sipping hot chocolate by the fire. Daniel had just stepped outside to grab more firewood when he noticed something strange. Across the yard, near the edge of the woods, stood a figure. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but the person was tall and completely still. For a moment, Daniel thought it might be Harold checking up on them, but something about the figure felt wrong. "Hey," Daniel called out, his voice sharp. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. "Babe?" Mia's voice came from the doorway. "What's going on?" "There's someone out there," Daniel said, pointing. Mia squinted into the darkness. "I don't see anything." Daniel turned back and his stomach dropped. The figure was gone. "Probably just my eyes playing tricks," he muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. Back inside, the unease lingered. Mia joked about Daniel scaring himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At around 11 p.m., as they were getting ready to toast the new year, a loud thud echoed from the roof. "What the hell was that?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the snowy ground and then the roof. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of movement. "I don't see anything," he said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe a branch fell?" Mia didn't look convinced. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and they tried to focus on the celebration. They poured champagne, turned on a playlist, and counted down the seconds. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. They kissed, clinking their glasses, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But their celebration was interrupted by a sound. A slow, deliberate scraping like nails on wood. It was coming from the back door. Daniel's heart raced as he grabbed the fireplace poker. He motioned for Mia to stay behind him as they approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out. The scraping stopped. Daniel flung the door open, but there was no one there. Just the endless stretch of snow-covered forest. "Okay, this is getting weird," Mia said, her voice shaking. Daniel locked the door and checked every window, making sure all the latches were secure. He tried to laugh it off, but his hands were trembling. They decided to go to bed early, hoping to sleep off the paranoia. Mia fell asleep quickly, but Daniel lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again, the scraping. This time it was at the bedroom window. Slowly, he turned his head, his breath hitching in his throat. A face was pressed against the glass. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared unblinking into the room. The man's lips were stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing crooked, yellowed teeth. Daniel froze, unable to move or speak. The man tilted his head as if amused, and then lifted a hand to tap gently on the glass. "Daniel," Mia whispered, having woken up and seen it too. The man's grin widened. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed Mia's hand and bolted for the door. They didn't stop to grab their shoes or coats. The icy air hit them like a wall as they ran to their car. Fumbling with the keys, Daniel managed to start the engine just as the man emerged from the shadows, sprinting toward them. The tires skidded on the icy driveway, but they managed to speed away. In the rearview mirror, Daniel saw the man standing in the middle of the road, watching them until they disappeared around a bend. When they reached town, they called the police. Officers went to the cabin but found no sign of the man. They did, however, find deep scratch marks on the back door and bedroom window, along with footprints circling the property. The Airbnb host, Harold, claimed he had no idea who it could have been, but Daniel and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. They never went back to the mountains again.